For 3.5 years, the Kremlin promised its citizens a bubble of safety. They pointed to their most powerful, layered air defenses, surrounding the center of Russian power like an impenetrable shield. Tonight, that shield didn't just crack, it was shattered. This isn't about the front lines anymore. This is a direct, shocking blow to the heart of Putin's regime. On November 29th, an unprecedented swarm of Ukrainian drones, not 10, not 20, but a massive wave, bypassed every radar, every anti-air battery, and flew straight into the Russian capital. Moscow rocked. The sound of explosions over Red Square is the sound of a historic lie unraveling. The lie that ordinary Russians are safe. The lie that the war is contained over there. And the lie that Russia's military power is anything close to what they brag about. Within hours, the Russian Ministry of Defense delivered a masterclass in clumsy, desperate propaganda. No damage. All drones shot down. Nothing to worry about. Just trust us. But we have the footage. Russian citizens recorded their own city on fire. They recorded the sounds of air defense systems panicking over residential areas. They recorded the immediate, chaotic suspension of 2 major international airports. This was not a minor incident. This was an earthquake-level strategic strike. The reality we must grasp tonight is simple. Moscow is no longer safe, and Vladimir Putin has lost control of his own sky. But the drone attack on the capital is only half the story. This brazen escalation from Kiev is coming exactly when Russia has been pushing its own boundaries, most recently with aggressive posturing that has directly provoked NATO in the Black Sea. The other major piece of breaking news, the Ukrainian Navy, often overlooked, has delivered a punishing counterblow. Using newly developed long-range maritime attack systems, they have struck deep into Russian naval logistics and critical fleet assets. These aren't just symbolic hits. These are attacks that choke the supply lines Russia uses to sustain its operations. The message is chillingly clear. You hit our people, we hit your power, and we will not be limited by your imaginary red lines. How did we get here? How did a war Russia expected to win in a week transform into a conflict where Ukraine can paralyze the airspace over the most heavily defended city on Earth? It's an incredible story of evolution under pressure. Early in the war, Kiev struggled to protect its own sky, but under existential threat, Ukraine became a pioneer, a global leader in cheap, long-range, AI-guided drone technology. Systems built in small workshops and tech hubs, which Russia once mocked, now possess a strike capability that even major world powers struggle to deploy effectively. Russia made a fatal error: complacency. They drained their air defense assets from Moscow to chase symbolic victories on other fronts. They believed their own lie that Ukraine was too busy, too weak, too afraid to be this bold. They left a massive gap, and Ukraine saw it. A direct strike on the capital is a blow to military assets, yes, but it is primarily a direct hit to public psychology. It forces the people Putin tried to keep insulated from the war to feel what Ukrainians feel every single night. The war is no longer over there. It is above their homes. This matters to you, the global audience, because it utterly shatters a long-standing geopolitical assumption that Russia is strong enough to protect its seat of power from any threat. If the capital can be penetrated, what part of the Russian military system is actually real? And if that capability is crumbling at the very root, what does it mean for the security of Europe, for NATO, and for the world order we all depend on? The Kremlin is panicking. They're facing 2 simultaneous devastating narratives: a humiliated military command and a capital city that knows it has been lied to. They thought their power was untouchable. They were wrong, and they are desperate to hide the full truth of what happened when Moscow's sky caught fire. The question is, what does Putin do next? Before we dive into the catastrophic details of how these drones sliced through Russian defenses and what the Navy strike means for the Black Sea, comment below. What do you think is a bigger threat to Putin right now? The loss of control over Moscow's sky or the destruction of naval assets by the Ukrainian Navy? The night the war arrived in Moscow was the most comprehensive failure of Russian military technology and doctrine since the start of this conflict. We need to go beyond the politics and propaganda to understand the tactical reality. The Kremlin sold the world on the image of an impenetrable anti-air dome over its capital, a sophisticated layered defense of S-400 long-range systems backed up by the deadly short-range Panzer S-1 batteries. The S-400 is Russia's pride, but it's designed to hunt high-flying jets and cruise missiles. Ukraine knew this. It understood the gap in the system, the fundamental weakness that Russia had ignored. The inability of these expensive, high-end systems to reliably track and engage a low-flying, slow, small radar cross-section drone swarm. The attack was a masterstroke of asymmetric warfare. It was designed to exploit that specific vulnerability. The incoming drones, cheap, domestically produced, and guided by a degree of AI autonomy, flew at extremely low altitudes, skimming the terrain. This flight profile made them virtually invisible to the long-range S-400 radars, which are optimized for threats operating at higher altitudes. But what about the Panzer systems? These are the workhorses, the air defense guns and missiles meant to be the last line of defense, specifically against UAVs and incoming munitions. They were deployed on the roofs of key buildings and positioned around government complexes. Yet, video after video recorded by terrified Moscow residents showed the Panzer systems firing wildly over residential areas. This wasn't a clean intercept far from the city limits. This was a desperate close-range engagement where the system was forced to react too late. The tactical reports, even the leaked ones from Russian military sources, have long pointed to the Panzer's Achilles heel. Its radar struggles to differentiate between small, slow drones and even large birds or ground clutter. It was not built to counter a coordinated swarm that approaches from multiple directions simultaneously. The Ukrainian strategy was saturation. By unleashing hundreds of UAVs, Russia claims 193 intercepted, a number that strains credulity. They forced the Panzer operators to fire their limited supply of expensive missiles at low-cost targets, effectively overloading the system until a critical mass of drones got through to their intended targets. The damage goes far beyond the shattered windows and smoke columns. The most recent and effective targets were not just government buildings, but the vital energy and logistical arteries that fuel the Russian war machine. Just days before this unprecedented Moscow strike, other drone operations demonstrated this focus. There were successful hits on oil refineries in the Samara region, and even more critically, a major blow to a heat and power station in the Moscow region, the Shatura Power Station. This is a facility that provides heating to tens of thousands of people. Think about the psychological impact. If the Kremlin cannot keep the lights and heat on for its own citizens just 75 miles from the capital, how can it promise victory and security to the millions of ordinary Russians living in fear? The war machine is not just being hit, it is being choked from its energy source, and its propaganda is being contradicted by the cold, dark reality of a winter night. This brings us to the second, equally dramatic escalation, the Ukrainian Navy's Black Sea counter-offensive. For years, Russia's Black Sea Fleet, once the undisputed master of that crucial waterway, has operated under the assumption of absolute naval superiority. Russia has consistently used this position to push NATO's boundaries, often with dangerous and aggressive maneuvers against Allied ships and aircraft. These were provocations calculated to test the unity and response time of the alliance. The Black Sea Fleet, however, has become a ghost of its former self. Its flagship was sunk, amphibious landing vessels have been destroyed, and now the Ukrainian Navy, using a new generation of sophisticated, domestically developed unmanned surface vessels, USVs, like the Magura V-type and Sea Baby drones, has moved the war deep into Russia's most secure naval bases. The latest, most punishing strike targeted the port of Novorossiysk. This is not just any port, it is Russia's second largest oil export center, and, crucially, a key fallback base for the Black Sea Fleet after their main headquarters in Sevastopol became too vulnerable. Reports, backed by satellite imagery, confirm a major Russian Project 1171 large landing ship was severely damaged and had to be towed. Furthermore, key logistical facilities and oil terminals at the port were also hit. This is a profound strategic victory. It means Ukraine has effectively denuded Crimea of its naval protection, forcing the fleet to retreat further east, targeted Russia's war funding by hitting oil export infrastructure, proved its ability to strike high-value assets deep inside Russian territory, even at a heavily guarded base like Novorossiysk. The consequence for NATO is immense. Russia's ability to project power and menace the alliance in the Black Sea region is collapsing. It means the critical grain corridors are safer, and it puts greater strategic pressure on Moscow's entire southern flank. This coordinated offensive, the drone swarm over Moscow, and the naval strike on Novorossiysk is not random. It is Kyiv declaring a new phase of the war. No sanctuary, no impunity. And as Russia's military assets crumbled, so did their credibility on the international stage. Just weeks ago, Russia was once again engaged in blatant and dangerous provocations against NATO airspace, sending swarms of drones and fighter jets into the territory of Poland, Romania, and Estonia. They were testing the limits, probing for weakness. This Ukrainian counterattack is the response. You try to escalate against NATO, you try to terrorize our civilians, and we will hit you in your most sensitive, most protected places. The narrative of Russian invincibility is not just dented, it is fundamentally broken. What we are witnessing is the transformation of Ukraine's defense industry into a powerful asymmetric strike force capable of challenging a major nuclear power on its own soil. The Kremlin can continue to lie, claiming all targets were shot down, but the smoke rising over Moscow and the crippled ships in Novorossiysk tell a very different story. A story of humiliation, technological decay, and a war that is now being fought on Russia's terms of maximum pain. What we must now analyze is the desperate and potentially reckless retaliation this double blow will provoke from a cornered Putin. The double blow of the Moscow drone swarm and the Novorossiysk naval strike has pushed the Kremlin to a critical tipping point. Putin is now facing a strategic and political crisis. Either accept the humiliation that Ukraine dictates the terms of engagement, even over his own capital, or escalate in a way that risks drawing the world into a new level of conflict. We have seen this playbook before. When Russia is publicly embarrassed by Ukrainian efficiency, the retaliation is almost always directed at the most vulnerable target, the Ukrainian civilian population and its critical infrastructure. The search results confirm the immediate and most likely response: a doubling down on the energy war. Russia has already successfully disabled about 50% of Ukraine's power generation capacity. Putin's answer to the shame of Moscow will be to try and turn the lights off across Ukraine in the dead of winter. This means intensified waves of cheap, mass-produced Iranian-style drones and cruise missiles aimed at substations, gas storage, and heating facilities. The strategy is clear. Break the will of the Ukrainian people and disrupt their industrial capacity, especially their domestic arms production. But the retaliation won't stop at infrastructure. A cornered regime often chooses a more dangerous kind of escalation, one that skirts the line of direct war with NATO, but punishes the West for its support of Kiev. We are already seeing evidence of this through Russia's shadow war of sabotage and subversion in Europe. Sabotage, attacks on critical infrastructure targets across NATO territory, including transportation hubs, government targets, and military supply chains. These are explosions and incidents designed to look like accidents or domestic criminality, making it impossible to trigger NATO's Article 5, but still severely impacting the flow of Western aid to Ukraine. Information warfare, an intensified campaign of disinformation and political chaos, designed to divide the NATO alliance and reinforce pro-Russian populism in member states. They aim to make the American public and European parliaments believe the cost of supporting Ukraine is simply too high. The nuclear calculus and the new red line. The most critical and dangerous component of this Russian response is its reliance on the nuclear deterrent bluff. The search results highlight that Putin has repeatedly attempted to draw a definitive red line, most recently with decrees that lower the threshold for using nuclear weapons, even in response to a conventional attack on Russian territory supported by a nuclear power. The drone strike on Moscow, while conventional, is precisely the kind of direct hit to the center of Russian power that feeds this escalatory rhetoric. However, the reality is that Putin's red lines have been exposed as hollow. Ukraine has repeatedly crossed them, striking the Kerch Bridge, sinking key Black Sea Fleet vessels, now penetrating the airspace over Moscow. In every case, Russia's threatened, tangible, and appropriate response has been underwhelming and proportional to the ongoing war, not a drastic, world-changing escalation. This pattern is essential for NATO's strategy. The key takeaway for the West is that Ukraine has successfully proved that these strikes, while strategically devastating to Russia, do not necessarily trigger the catastrophic escalation Putin threatens. This creates a terrifying but vital new strategic space for Ukraine and its allies. NATO's response, deterrence, and resilience. NATO's role has never been more complicated or critical. The alliance must manage two things simultaneously. Deterrence. Maintaining a credible, unified front to ensure that Russia does not mistake the drone strike humiliation for a green light to attack a NATO member state. The core of this remains Article 5, the principle of collective defense, which has been the cornerstone of the alliance since the Cold War. NATO continues to reinforce its eastern flank to show that any move against a member is an attack on the whole. Resilience, strengthening the civilian side of defense against Russia's shadow war. This means a greater focus on cyber defense, protecting critical infrastructure like fiber optic cables, power grids, and ports from subversion and sabotage, and enhancing defense against CBRN, chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear threats, an area that has been under-prioritized since the Cold War. Ultimately, the attacks on Moscow and Novorossiysk have achieved Ukraine's core strategic objective, forcing the war out of Ukraine's territory and into the Russian consciousness and economy. It is now up to Putin to decide how far he will go to restore his tarnished image, and up to NATO to ensure that his humiliation does not become a global catastrophe. The stakes are higher now than at any point since the start of this conflict. I want to know what you think. Has Ukraine's use of deep strikes permanently changed the balance of power in the Black Sea? Or is Russia too powerful to be deterred? The combined military and naval humiliation, the drone strike on Moscow and the Novorossiysk assault, doesn't just hurt Russia's defense capability. It hits the economic and psychological contract that Vladimir Putin built his 25-year rule upon. For decades, the deal with the Russian public was simple. I give you stability and increasing prosperity, and you give me political control. The war and these latest strikes are tearing that contract apart on three critical fronts. 1. Economic crippling and fiscal pain. The long-range strikes are not targeting the front lines. They are targeting Russia's wallet. The search results confirm Ukraine's strategy is to bankrupt the war machine from within. Oil and gas export crisis. The attack on Novorossiysk, Russia's second-largest oil export center, temporarily halted shipments, removing an estimated 2% of global supply from the market. This disruption cuts directly into the hard currency that funds the war. Coupled with the systematic destruction of oil refineries in regions like Samara and Feodosia, the International Energy Agency now forecasts Russia's refinery processing rates will be suppressed until at least mid-2026. The budget drain. Every successful strike creates a deeper fiscal deficit. The Kremlin is responding not by cutting war spending, but by increasing taxes on ordinary Russians, raising the VAT, and hiking fees on everything from car registrations to alcohol. The public is being forced to choose between guns and butter, and the guns are winning. The two Russias. This pain is amplified by the sheer corruption and disparity on display. As ordinary families struggle with rising costs and fuel shortages, the ruling elite flaunts staggering illicit wealth. The contrast between burning refineries and the staggering luxury of the Kremlin elite fuels public resentment and increases political instability. Second, psychological shock and the erosion of morale. For the first time since the war began, the reality of the conflict is a direct, visible, and audible threat to Muscovites. This shatters the propaganda bubble. The end of isolation. The Kremlin's primary goal has always been to shield the capital and the wealthy urban centers from the war's consequences. The sight of air defense systems firing over residential high-rises in Moscow and the forced closure of international airports demonstrates unequivocally that the war is at home. War fatigue and the desire for peace. While state-run polls still inflate support for the war, independent surveys show an increasing division in Russian society. As far back as late 2024, a majority of Russians were already favoring a ceasefire over continued fighting. The cost, both in lives lost, Russia is projected to hit 1 million casualties by mid-2025, and an economic hardship is increasingly seen as producing more harm than benefit. The unraveling consensus. The old social contract, which prioritized stability and domestic prosperity, is being replaced by a pervasive sense of fear and uncertainty. The Kremlin's constant messaging about Russia's strength is now directly contradicted by the visible vulnerability of its most protected city. This is the psychological cost that can, over time, erode the passive support that sustains the regime. 3. Strategic debt and pinned forces. The strategic fallout of the attacks extends to Russia's force disposition, creating a military debt that Kiev can exploit. Naval displacement. The Black Sea Fleet has been rendered functionally homeless. The necessity of retreating from Sevastopol to Novorossiysk, only to be struck there again, proves that Ukraine holds the initiative in the Black Sea. Russia must now commit valuable, high-end assets to defending ports and non-military logistics, resources that cannot be used on the front lines. Air defense thinning. The need to bring the S-400 and Pantsir systems back to defend the immediate airspace over Moscow means that other fronts and newly occupied territories are now less protected. This thinning creates new opportunities for Ukrainian deep strikes against military command centers and logistical nodes closer to the front. The question now is not if the Kremlin can sustain the war, but how long it can sustain the illusion of safety and prosperity that keeps its people compliant, and how much economic devastation the West is willing to tolerate to see the Russian war machine ultimately fail. Do you believe the economic damage from these deep strikes will eventually force Putin to the negotiating table, or is the defense sector's priority too high to be affected? The most acute danger is no longer the predictable Russian retaliation against Ukrainian cities, but inadvertent escalation between Russia and NATO. The search results highlight that this happens when intentional actions, like Ukraine's deep strikes, have unintended consequences that cross a Russian red line that isn't always visible. The most dangerous scenario remains a misidentified target, a Ukrainian drone or long-range missile, potentially guided by Western intelligence, malfunctions, or is shot down and lands on NATO territory, like the repeated incidents near the Polish and Romanian borders. Mistaking Western weapons for Ukrainian, Russia could intentionally or inadvertently target a Ukrainian command center, believing it to be a key decision-making hub directly controlled by NATO personnel, leading to a catastrophic miscalculation. Russia has consistently defined Western-supplied tactical strikes into Russian territory as a major escalation. The Baltic region flashpoint. As Russia bleeds assets in Ukraine, the long-term threat remains the Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia. The most stressing scenario for NATO is a rapid, limited territory seizure in the Baltics, calculated to test if the alliance will truly trigger Article 5 over a small piece of land. Russia is gambling that global risk aversion, fueled by nuclear threats, will prevent a full NATO response. The current situation, where Ukraine exposes Russian conventional weakness, ironically raises the stakes for this future confrontation. To manage this, NATO cannot simply react. It must maintain credible deterrence, backed by its nuclear sword against the most serious threats, while preparing for a prolonged, protracted war supported by a rapidly expanding industrial base. The future of asymmetric warfare. Data as ammunition. The drone strikes on Moscow mark the full arrival of asymmetric warfare defined by technology, not by conventional strength. Cost imposition. Ukraine is demonstrating that an expenditure of a few $1,000s on an AI-guided, domestically built drone can inflict millions in damage to Russian oil infrastructure or cripple a multi-million-dollar air defense system. This is a battle of economic attrition. The data. Battlefield. Future warfare is fully networked and data-driven, where data becomes the ammunition. Ukraine's success is predicated on its ability to integrate Western satellite intelligence, signals analysis, and homegrown AI systems to find the gaps in Russia's defense layers. European militaries, like Germany's, are already adapting their defense plans to field dedicated long-range strike drone units by the end of the decade, directly learning from Ukraine's success. International law and self-defense. From the perspective of international law, Russia's 2022 invasion was an illegal crime of aggression. Ukraine's strikes deep inside Russia, targeting military and economic infrastructure that funds the war, fall under the established right of self-defense under the UN Charter's Article 51. The West is increasingly accepting the reality that Ukraine must be allowed to strike the source of the aggression to survive. Conclusion: the war for narrative and resolve. Ultimately, the most important consequence of the Moscow and Novorossiysk strikes is the destruction of Putin's narrative. The illusion of invulnerability, the foundation of his domestic authority, is gone. The Kremlin is now fighting two wars: a brutal physical war in Ukraine and a desperate war for narrative and resolve at home and abroad. The path to peace will not be paved by diplomatic appeals alone, but by compelling weakness. Ukraine's deep strikes are accelerating the systemic crisis in Russia, forcing a choice between sustaining the war and stabilizing the regime's economic and political control. The question is whether the Western world, now fully aware of both Russia's genuine weakness and its capacity for reckless escalation, will maintain its resolve until that systemic crisis forces a meaningful shift in Moscow's position. Final comment. Call. After the latest humiliation, do you think Putin's most likely next move will be a massive increase in strikes on Ukrainian energy infrastructure or a dangerous escalation near a NATO border, e.g., in the Baltic or Black Sea regions? Thank you for watching this video. Click here to watch another video that might interest you.